is by Paul Rezkala. And to be honest, I have very little idea who Paul Rezkala is. Well, I just like to know, but it turns out he is in Hillsdale College, which is, no, I have no idea where Hillsdale. It's in Michigan, I guess. And he is a kind of moral philosopher and a professorial fellow, which sounds very fancy. All right, so it starts off with this kind of picture of a Hindu woman. Well, that's the title. You'll see the spelling of Hindu in the title of the picture is Hindoo, which is not the contemporary spelling of Hindu. Throwing herself on the funeral pyre of her husband. He starts off talking about this kind of case of known as Suti or Sati, where there is a tradition whereas if if a man dies, then his wife, when he is put on a funeral pyre, she will also, as a living person, throw herself on the funeral pyre and die. The kind of observation here is it's one of a woman. She took the widow took several steps towards the funeral pyre and crawled on top of her husband's corpse to embrace his neck. The pain was excruciating, but if she dismounted, she would shame her family and probably be lynched by a mob anyway. So she lay there. So it was practiced, it was commonplace in parts of India until the 19th century. The idea was that it allowed the dead man's possessions and property to pass back into the hands of his family. I guess if she didn't die, then she would keep on to his possessions. So she was expected to commit suicide and fulfill her duty of chastity. So I guess the idea was also that she should not be ever having sex with any other man. And the best way to guarantee that was for her to kill herself. Well, that doesn't sound very good, does it? I mean, that doesn't sound like something we would feel good about. It sounds in some ways kind of highly problematic. It's not some kind of expression of grief about how upset she is and how her life without her husband is so unbearable that she couldn't go on living. It's a financial matter and a cultural matter about with a threat that she would even die anyway. I guess certainly, I guess suicide is legal in the United States, right? But if a woman was thinking of practicing Suti in the United States, there would be a lot of movement to try and stop her from doing that. I haven't seen any news reports of that actually having been attempted. Um, but so one sort of tempting thing to say, well, I mean, I guess it's at least for some people might be to say, well, in the United States we don't do that, but in 19th century and earlier India, that was a common practice. And therefore, we should not judge other people for what they do, even if we find those things morally bad or morally problematic. We should not judge. And there are plenty of other kind of cases where of cultural difference where we find that other people's culture is quite bizarre. And often it's actually quite a liberal idea to say that it is wrong for us to impose our standards on other people. We think that people who impose their moral standards on other people, they're far too judgy. And they should be open-minded, and they should certainly understand that things are done differently in other places, and that there's no way for us to judge other people. So one way it's put is that, like, especially for us in the West, to be judging other cultures is a kind of arrogance for us to assume that our values are universal and that we should simply impose our values on other people. Do you think that things are made more complicated in the contemporary world, where, and it's not just the contemporary world, immigration has been a fact of human life, basically ever since there were humans. I mean, like, probably some of the earliest humans were nomadic, so people were always moving around and intermixing cultures, and certainly people have been moving from culture to culture for ever since the start of cultures. So the idea that there is a culture which is purely isolated and out of touch with other cultures or not interacting is basically nearly always wrong. There's always cultural interaction. But I guess one big question is, when you looking at something like this, certainly from a liberal point of view, we might be torn, because we might also want to say this culture is totally patriarchal, that it's a matter of, it's a culture which values women's lives less than men's lives. And we would want to say that kind of inequality is unacceptable. And therefore we want to say that it's a perfectly appropriate thing to get rid of the practice of sudi. Now, I guess there is a question about empire. The British notoriously took over India and imposed kind of Western values on India. So it was the British officials who outlawed sudi, and so there's also kind of issues of imperialism. Britain was expanding its empire, and these days we may also have major concerns about countries expanding their empire. When Putin wants to expand the Russian empire, we have a lot of problems with that, right? So there may be all sorts of issues about kind of the British people taking over India and imposing their values on India. But so, and it can be hard to separate out that issue from the issue of whether it's moral progress to ban the practice of sudi. Right. So So all sorts of issues get raised. One of them is about the question about whether there are morally objective values which are the same for everyone, and how do we kind of know what the moral truth is. And so this is definitely a part of meta ethics. So meta ethics is the study of kind of the status of ethical claims. So we're pretty familiar in different normative moral theories like utilitarianism and rights theory and maybe virtue ethics and the ethics of care. They are all sort of normative views. But meta-ethics is the study of like, well, how do we know whether a view is universal or just culturally specific? And so those are the kind of the big issues. And so there are issues of if you're a moral realist, generally the idea is that morality is real. And we might kind of draw comparisons with kind of scientific realism. I mean, if you believe in electrons, then you think electrons actually exist, and you don't think that electrons exist in the United States, but they don't exist in India. I mean, that would seem to be like a ridiculous view, right? So we think that scientific truth tells us about electrons and tells us that it's real. So if you think that rights exist, then it would seem like similarly, you would think they exist everywhere. They don't just exist in the United States, they exist everywhere. And so similarly with a truth like X is right, then if you're a full-scale realist, then you think that X is right everywhere. It's not just true for a particular group of people. But if people disagree about morality, then it seems like things are kind of a bit different. So definitely, I mean, it seems like for a lot of truth, we want to say something is either true or false. So this article talks about the claim that George Washington was the 13th president of the United States, and that is false. And so it seems like, well, that's just a matter of historical fact. And so moral realism is the view that there are mind-independent facts about ethics. The idea is that there are just moral truths which are true independent of what people think. So a moral realist would say it is wrong to rape. And that's not just a matter of opinion. It's not just a matter of kind of culture. That's actually a moral truth, true for all humans. So it may be that there are some cultures where rape is accepted. And certainly, I mean, even in Western culture, I mean, it was only in the 20th century that marital rape was made illegal. So I guess there's a question about whether. So I guess it used to be believed that whenever a husband wanted sex, he could get it from his wife. The question of like whether there was no question whether she could say no. It was used to be thought that there was no such thing as rape in marriage. So views about rape have changed, but what a realist about rape would say is like, well, that was simply morally wrong. It wasn't just that thing, morality changed, but people didn't understand morality back in the past, and now we have a better understanding of morality. And I guess we would want to say we would want to say similar things about slavery. There have been cultures, and certainly if you look at ancient ancient Greece, ancient Rome, then the vast majority of people accepted slavery. And we would want to say about those cultures that they were wrong, if you're a moral realist. That there is no we can't be relativist about it. We want to say slavery is always wrong. So this article gives three different kinds of relativism. I think these are sort of useful distinctions to make. So the mildest and least controversial is simply a what it calls descriptive relativism. So descriptive relativism is the idea that simply as a matter of fact about how people live, different people hold different values. And it seems like that's probably true as a matter of fact about different cultures. So, I've just given examples of values changing over time. So we talk about rape, we can talk about slavery, and we can talk generally about, say, the value of men and women having equal value. The article gives different examples, but also good ones. So like many cultures in the past and still now have seen homosexual, well, I guess the book says, the article says homosexuality. Homosexuality, I guess these days is a sort of identity about how people think about themselves. I suspect that probably a lot of the focus is more on not about so much about identity, but about homosexual acts. So especially men having sex with men. So certainly many cultures saw that as wrong. Similarly with polygamy. In the US, polygamy is illegal. It's you cannot be married to more than one person. And I guess the reason for that is that people think it's morally wrong. I mean, right now there's not like there's not a huge polygamy movement in the US. I guess polygamy has been most associated with Mormons. So exactly why polygamy was outlawed by all the states, I think, is a sort of interesting question. I don't think I've ever had a student who's like tried to argue that polygamy should be made legal. But I don't know why. I mean, I guess it seems like, there is some interest in polygamy, and you can go, for example, on Reddit, and you'll find a whole polygamy group where people they don't actually officially get married because that's not legal, but they obviously these days the difference between being married and just living with somebody and living as a couple is not really a very significant difference apart from a few legal differences, right? Plenty of people live together as sort of like as couples, husband and wife, husband and husband, or whatever it is. And they basically effectively live as a married couple, whether or not they have a marriage certificate. And so there are people who live in polyamorous relationships, at least. So it seems that the US may be changing its moral views about that. Certainly there are other cultures which have standardly and do continue to practice polygamy. And that's generally the practice of one man having more than one wife. Some people think of that as a sort of sexist possible culture, but again, it's a big issue. So like, certainly it seems that there are significant moral differences between different cultures. So descriptive relativism is simply saying that there are kind of different cultures with different values. I think it can be kind of complicated because a lot of the time morality is bound up with religion, and different cultures have different religions. So it also goes to sort of metaphysical beliefs about what gods exist, and what beliefs they have about what gods tell them to do. And so these things like that, that's more complicated than simply having a moral belief. It's having a whole kind of set of religious ideas. And so I think that makes it more complicated. All right, so so certainly there are some moral differences between cultures. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that every moral culture or every culture is completely morally different from other moral cultures. And certainly we expect to see a lot of overlap in values between different cultures. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that other cultures are completely incomprehensible to us. And there are obviously there are going to be linguistic differences and religious differences. But, we can understand those. Okay, so now the fact that different cultures have different moral beliefs doesn't necessarily imply that that we should accept all those different beliefs. For example, if you look at science, it used to be some cultures believed, including a lot of Western cultures, that the Earth is the center of the universe and the sun revolved around the Earth. Right? That used to be a very commonly shared belief, but that turned out simply to be false. Right? So the idea that you can have some cultures where you have a very common belief, it doesn't necessarily follow that that it's true or that we should accept it. And we might well want to say to another culture, if they believe that the Earth is the center of the universe, you're wrong. The Earth is not the center of the universe. Right? And so we could accept descriptive relativism and say, yeah, you have different beliefs, but unfortunately, your beliefs are wrong. And we may well want to say that about slavery. We may want to say that about polygamy. And we may want to say that about Suti, right? That their beliefs are wrong. That it's not; those things are not morally permissible. So you can be a descriptive relativist, which basically is just saying that different cultures have different values without accepting any other stronger kind of relativism. So then we can look at meta-ethical relativism, which is a stronger claim. Right. So the ancient writer Herodotus, who was an ancient Greek historian, said culture is king, which is a pretty strong statement, which means seems to embrace relativism in a stronger way. So meta-ethical relativism is exactly that. It says that observing radical differences in the ways that different cultures practiced religion, burial, household organization, even eating preferences, he concluded that there is no standard beyond a culture to prescribe good and bad behavior. Right? So his basic point was like there is no way to kind of decide who's right and wrong. And certainly we might want to look at that sort of view when it comes. So far I've been sort of comparing scientific beliefs with moral beliefs and saying, look, we believe in scientific realism. But we believe in scientific realism, it thinks, because we can prove that science is right. You can prove that electrons exist. You can prove that the Earth goes around the sun. You can also prove that the Earth is not the center of the universe. So those are scientifically provable facts. But can you prove that Sooty is wrong? Can you prove that slavery is wrong? That seems like at least more debated. Right? I'm not going to say that you can't prove it, but many people are pretty sure, in fact, that you can prove that, for example, slavery is wrong. But it becomes a big question. To what extent is it possible to prove those things? And like, so Herodotus said, it's not possible. The only standard that we can have for moral beliefs is what a culture believes is right and wrong. There's no greater standard. So metaethical relativism says, as it says here, moral truths are actually only true relative to specific groups of people. So this means that whether a moral belief is true is dependent or relative to the standpoint of the person or culture that has the belief. So someone in Singapore and someone in England can both say it's sunny outside, but it's possible the claim is only true for one of them. That because that's verifiable, whether it's sunny or not. And it is going to be different in different cultures. In a similar way, metaethical relativism is a position that ethical statements are only true relative in the context in which they are spoken. In other words, when someone claims that some practice is moral, then the claim is true if her culture believes and lives as if it's moral. To use another example, if a culture holds the view that having premarital sexual relations is immoral, then for that culture, it is true that having premarital sexual relations is immoral. All right. So the one thing about metaethical relativism is that it acts as if it's pretty clear whether or not a culture believes something is moral or not moral. But how do you know what a culture says? Now, it's easier if you have a culture where everybody believes the same thing. And I think that's a little hard for us to imagine, or at least if we imagine it, we imagine it in a very simplistic way. Because in New York City and in Long Island, we're very used to people having extremely different moral beliefs. And we can look, I mean, when we talk about different cultures, I guess we look at sort of different ethnic cultures. I mean, you can talk about Irish Americans. Well, I mean, do Irish Americans have particular kind of moral beliefs? I mean, I'm not sure if they have any particular moral beliefs. Generally, Irish Americans tend to come from a Catholic culture, so they are influenced by Catholic beliefs. It used to be a sort of stereotype of Irish Americans that they would have big families because they didn't practice contraception. But so maybe some issues about around sex, like premarital sex, not using contraception, used to be commonly practiced, but these days that doesn't seem to be particularly true. I don't even think Irish American families these days have much larger families than other people. Doesn't seem to be like a big thing. And then, so if you think about different cultures if you look at like Hispanic cultures, do they have different morality than other people? I think that's pretty dubious. I mean, maybe there are some differences. Again, maybe Hispanic cultures are influenced by Catholicism, but not universally. Maybe Spanish-speaking people occasionally or tend to have slightly larger families, but that may be changing. And in a lot of Spanish-speaking countries, the population rate is going down. I think Mexico, the population is actually declining now. People are having fewer kids. So it seems like it's tricky for us to really identify kind of what a culture is in a precise way. And as I mentioned before, there has always been immigration. There's sort of interesting work going on in historical study today. I guess I'm particularly interested in English history. And you might think like, oh, England, if you think back, say, to the year 1000, in England, you think, oh yeah, everybody in England was probably kind of Anglo-Saxon, stereotypically Anglo-Saxon in the year 1000, and was kind of stereotypically white. It turns out, actually, there's plenty of historical study showing that even in the year 1000, England was actually pretty multicultural. There were all sorts of there was huge amounts of immigration in England, and there were quite a bunch of different cultures going on. So I think it's actually going to be very difficult for us to identify any culture where everybody believes the same thing. I mean, we have there are some very exceptional cultures, especially island cultures. There can be island cultures where it was hard to get to the island, and so there were very few visitors. So in those sorts of cultures, it tends to be more homogeneous. Then we can also think of some highly remote native cultures in the middle of forests. You might think about that, say in Africa. There could be very remote areas where you have very few visitors, and you get a more homogeneous culture. I suspect even in those cases, there was actually probably quite a lot of moving around and cultural transmission. So it actually may be very difficult to find a culture where there was just everybody believed the same thing and everybody had a shared past, right? So then it makes it much more complicated for a relativism then, because when you say, oh yeah, one culture believes one thing, it's like, well, no, that's not true. It's very difficult to find a culture where everybody believes the same thing. I mean, if you look at, say, the history of Western Europe and the Middle East, for instance, or even the Far East, certainly there were cases where different religions had predominance. So one thing you see through a lot of European history is the dominance of the Catholic Church. And I mean, what would happen if you lived in one of those countries dominated by the Catholic Church and you spoke out against the Catholics? What would they do? They would kill you. Right? So definitely there could be times when religion would stamp its beliefs on a whole group of people. Right? There, in some ways, we're used to sort of religious dominance, and I think the history of Islam is kind of complicated. Certainly, there are cases where Islam gave people strong incentives to convert to Islam, and maybe sometimes that was force and violence. There are also cases where, say, in southern Spain in the kind of Middle Ages, there were strong tax advantages if you converted to Islam. So like you would actually pay less tax if you converted to Islam. So I sort of interested. I mean, like, I guess maybe it's hard for us to imagine, but I don't find it hard to imagine that people might at least say they converted to Islam in order to pay less tax. You know, generally, I'm pretty much willing to lie about all sorts of things so I can pay less tax, right? So, and then you lie about it, but then you have to kind of pretend like you're practicing Islam. So eventually, maybe you just end up practicing Islam. Certainly in the history of the West and the Middle East, it seems like there was religious dominance, and that did sort of stamp a culture. But it's also worth noting that even in religion, there are often there's a whole lot of religious variation, right? And obviously, among Christianity today, there's a huge amount of variation. A lot of fundamentalist Christians seem to be voting for pretty far-right views. A lot of other Christians would seem to hold a view which is basically pretty close to socialism or even communism. The idea that you should do away with all your property and everybody should be equal. So there's a lot of variation among within a religion. I think maybe there was less variation kind of several hundred years ago, but still there's some variation. When you think about like the meta-ethical relativism, and you're saying a culture kind of believes something, I think that's kind of complicated. One way of looking at it is say, well, you simply look at what the majority believe. And the majority is like 51%, right? So, and then it was like the majority of who? The majority of all the adults, the majority of all the men. Exactly who are you looking at in terms of like thinking about the majority? So even then, if you want to say, oh yeah, you go by what the majority of a culture believes, you still have to specify the majority of who. I guess one sort of topic, one sort of example that is given quite a lot is if you think about late 1930s Germany. What did people actually believe in late 1930s Germany? Did they really believe in fascism? It's like, well, some did. There was all sorts of social pressures. If you went against fascism, you could be condemned, you could lose your property. So in fact, there was a lot of political force used. Did the majority of Germans like really believe in the principles of fascism? Did they really believe that Jews were inferior and should be exterminated? I mean, that wasn't a question that was put on the polls. There was certainly a great deal of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic belief back in 1930s Germany. I think so. I mean, I think the facts are actually more kind of hard to pin down. We might. It's plausible that 51% of Germans did believe in fascism. Maybe 51% of Germans did believe that Jews were inferior. And if that's true, then that kind of meta-ethical relativism would say then in 1930s Germany, Jews were inferior, because that's what meta-ethical relativism says. You might look at the United States, say in like the 1820s. Did the majority of people in the United States believe that slavery was right? Well, I mean, slavery was practiced mostly in the South. And so in New York, but if you looked at New York, did most New Yorkers believe that slavery was right in the 1820s? It's a kind of interesting historical question. Certainly, it would seem like the majority of the South would have believed it. And again, that then the question is like, well, how do you divide? How do you work out what a culture is? Would we say like culture is Southern culture versus Northern culture? Would we want to divide it up by states? So I think meta-ethical relativism is kind of pretty complicated. If you're actually going to hold it seriously, then it raises all sorts of issues about how do you identify what culture you're talking about is, and how do you specify that culture? Okay. So I guess all of those things are things that that I just talked about were things that the author of the article doesn't actually say. But I think if you're going to talk about that stuff, then it's important to kind of talk about it to raise those issues. All right. So the third category of relativism, which he takes to be the kind of strongest kind, is what he calls normative relativism. So this says that it goes beyond descriptive and meta-ethical relativism and makes an even grander claim. So according to this view, no person or culture ought to judge the ethical codes of other cultures as being inferior, nor should any culture intervene or in another culture to prevent it from carrying out the specifics of its ethical code. So this is like very much the idea that not only should we not judge other cultures, but we shouldn't do anything to change other cultures. So the normative relativist says that we might prefer the specific morality of our own culture and even be able to offer reasons for doing so, but this does not imply that ours is superior to that of others. So normative relativists argue that because no objective independent standpoint from which to evaluate, there is no, because there's no objective independent standpoint from which to evaluate ethical codes exist, no culture can justifiably say that its morality is objectively superior. Right. So, I mean, to use that example I was just giving in terms of the United States, if you separate out Northern culture from Southern culture, then normative relativism would say that it would be totally wrong for a Northern culture to either judge or try and change Southern culture. So we would say that it would be morally wrong to try and change a slave-owning culture, because you can't judge and you shouldn't intervene in a culture which practices different morality from yours. So as the author says, on the face of it, this might strike us as problematic. In fact, maybe more than on the face of it, we might say that's not just a superficial thing. Actually, normative relativism is actually kind of really problematic. We might want to say that if we do view, I think obviously it's a great simplification to say that Northern culture judged Southern culture wrong and wanted to intervene. But if you imagine a sort of alternative history where that was true, then we might want to say, yeah, it's completely right for a slave-owning culture to try and intervene in a slave-owning culture and change it. So our author says, this principle of normative relativism itself is only specific to our culture and does not necessarily apply to other cultures. One of the if you're going to be a relativist, then it seems like normative relativism is a moral view, and if it's a moral view, then it should be only true in a particular culture. Normative relativism can't be universally true because there is no universal morally true morality, according to relativism. So normative relativism seems to be kind of self-defeating in a sense. It seems to be holding up a moral view as universal when it's impossible for there to be any universal moral views according to normative and even meta-ethical relativism. So as he says, in other words, just because my culture accepts normative relativism, this does not entail that all cultures must abide by the same principle. All right. So it seems like there's something very self-defeating about normative relativism. Um, so it's often said that obviously the examples of like slavery and sexism and Nazism are all sort of cases where which sort of push against being kind of tolerant. Whereas, I mean, if you think of other cases, I mean, I think maybe polygamy, we might want to say we shouldn't judge another culture which practices polygamy. So our culture does not really practice polygamy, or didn't. Maybe it's changing, but other cultures do. And there it seems that, at least to a liberal, oh yeah, we shouldn't judge other cultures which practice polygamy. Okay, I mean, I guess one of the differences is like in slave cultures, you're causing massive suffering to. They're causing massive suffering to slaves. They're killing slaves. They're using force. And so that seems to be something where we want to kind of bring out the idea of universal rights and say that's completely wrong. Whereas when it comes to polygamy, it doesn't seem like there's the same sort of moral debate is in play. I mean, you might want to say it's not such a polygamy just isn't so bad. Right. So certainly for some things where you have a kind of diversity of different views, certainly it's sort of plausible to say that we shouldn't judge people, but that we should be tolerant. As our author gets to, he says there are cultures where there is moral debate within the culture. So cultures can disagree about something like the morality of homosexuality. Certainly in some countries, homosexual practice is outlawed and is punishable by death. Birth control is a different example. So apparently 92% of Americans think that birth control is morally acceptable. I'm kind of surprised it's only 92%. I mean, like, because I've never met anybody who thinks birth control is wrong. Never. I mean, I've talked to a bunch of people. Nobody has ever said to me, birth control is wrong. I guess I even like some Catholics, like some Catholic, they might say something like, I don't practice birth control because it's against my religion. I've never heard anybody say birth control is wrong for everyone. I guess I have met people who say premarital sex is wrong, but I mean, again, I think it's hey, so well, certainly in New York, it's hard to imagine somebody kind of seriously saying premarital sex is always wrong. It seems like kind of that's just not something that most people. I mean, I would think like probably like it's more like 1 or 2% of Americans think that birth control is morally wrong. But who knows? I mean, maybe there are places where lots of people think birth control is wrong. So we might want to say, well, suppose there are cultures where everybody thinks birth control is wrong. Then, at least for those sorts of issues, relativism is plausible that we shouldn't judge those views. All right. So one thing a moral realist can say is like that if you believe there are universal values, you can say that the differences aren't really differences in morality, they're difference in knowledge about the world. Or there are different sort of other sorts of beliefs. I guess an example I like is cannibalism. Here, people think cannibalism is wrong. Now, there's different forms of cannibalism, right? I guess, like, so there's the Jeffrey Dahmer kind of cannibalism, where you go out and kill people and then chop them up and eat them. That seems to be pretty wrong, for all sorts of reasons. Maybe especially because it's preceded by going out and killing people. Now, other forms of cannibalism is like, what happens when just somebody dies naturally? And as part of a religious ceremony or a religious tradition, when somebody is already dead, you take some part of their body and cook it and eat it. Now, I think obviously for us in New York, we may have a visceral reaction to that. You may think that is just disgusting. But certainly it doesn't involve killing anybody. And it may, for some cultures, it actually goes along with ideas of helping people continue in the afterlife, continue in another world. So we might think, well, that kind of cannibalism is much more permissible because it goes along with the religious beliefs about people's being able to continue living past their physical death. Other forms of cannibalism are in some ways more understandable to us, where if you have war between one tribe and another, one tribe may, when another tribe defeats the other, the ultimate owning of the other tribe is not just killing them in the war, but actually eating them. So that's a much more violent thing, but you can see that as a part of I mean, in some ways it could sort of make sense, like, well, maybe it says something about me that it makes sense to me, that the idea that you might really show your victory over another person by eating them. I mean, there is a sort of like, oh yeah, that's the total owning of another person by eating them. And you might say, well, if you think war is okay, then the sort of symbolic culmination of war is like showing total victory is actually eating another person. So there might be ways in which we might, it's more to do with ceremony and cultural beliefs. We might be more willing to say, well, it's not so much about moral difference, but other sorts of differences. So a moral realist may say that. There's also different sort of environmental conditions. So some cultures practice killing of old people. And we might say, well, killing old people, you can't do that because that's violating their rights. But there are some cultures where one believes that one lives on in an afterlife with the same body that one died with in order to build huts, find food, and raise a family in the afterlife. And one must not have died at such an old age as to prevent one's body from being useful for these things. For this reason, the group members ensure that the elderly will be able to successfully overcome the challenges of the afterlife by ending their lives before their bodies become decrepit. So they're old, but they're not that old. If you have those beliefs about the afterlife, it may make sense. Also, there may be cases where you have scarce amounts of food, and it may be that having an old person who's no longer able to work means that food resources get used, and that means that other people are going to go hungry. So we might say, well, in cases of great scarcity, it may be much more morally permissible to encourage old people to, as some cultures do, walk off into the snow and freeze to death. So we think that's wrong. in our culture, but our culture is not really one where there's a scarcity of food. All right, so maybe the moral realist can defend moral realism and say, well, there can be other reasons why moral kind of cultural different traditions legitimately vary from culture to culture. Right. So as I was mentioning before, that our author does talk about problems with excuse me, problems with relativism. One of the big ones is relative to who, how do you define what a culture is? And so we also think that I guess another problem is that relativism seems to view that any minority view is necessarily false. So if you have a culture where suppose where a minority of the culture thinks that slavery is wrong, relativism says that the majority view is right, therefore by definition the minority view is wrong. So the minority view would always say that the minority view is always wrong. Also, it's relativism, both meta-ethical relativism and normative relativism hold the view that there can be no such thing as moral progress. Certainly for our culture, we think our culture is getting better by banning slavery, increasing more equality, especially for the equality between the sexes, but equality between the races. So it seems that we want to say we're making moral progress. And in order to be able to say we're making moral progress, we have to be some kind of moral realist, and we have to reject relativism. Okay. I guess there's one last thing I want to look at, which is the idea that some moral views, some moral claims are actually universal. So I won't look at this very long, but so here's a news report from 2019, which says that there are 7 moral rules found all around the world. So anthropologists say that there are 7 universal moral rules. And the rules are: help your family, help your group, return favors, be brave, defer to superiors, divide resources fairly, and respect others' property. So the claim is that no matter which culture you look at, all cultures believe in those 7 moral rules. Which it seems like, well, then at least those are 7 moral rules. They're kind of vague, and they might be interpreted differently. But it might be that even if there's moral diversity about the things we've been talking about, and it seems like we might wonder how these moral rules are interpreted, because it seems like they don't necessarily fit with the idea that slavery is okay, for example. Because it seems like, say, with dividing resources fairly, that's what does fairly mean? Does that mean that some people? Does that mean that sometimes people don't get any division? So it's a bit vague, but I mean there is at least some possibility that there could be moral rules which are universally accepted by in human nature. And so you get the lead author of this study, Dr. Oliver Scott Curry, saying that the debate between moral universalists and moral relativists has raged for centuries, but we have some answers. People everywhere face a similar set of social problems and use a similar set of moral rules to solve them. As predicted, these 7 moral rules appear to be universal across cultures. Everyone everywhere shares a common moral code. all agree that cooperating, promoting the common good is the right thing to do. I think, I mean, this might be a slightly grand claim on the part of these anthropologists, but it is an interesting idea and one that is worth thinking about. And other people have defended this idea previously, that in fact, there's actually quite a lot of universal morality that we can find in all human cultures, which would then mean that if we were going to accept relativism, it would seem like relativism is actually more diminished, and even descriptive relativism, it's not total difference, it's just like a small difference among some values, but in fact, there are quite a lot of core values we all share. All right, so I think that's as much as I want to say about that.